Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. What a tremendous crowd. It's wonderful to see all of you out there, and thanks for joining us. My name is Steve Light, and I am privileged to be serving as the Interim Dean of the College of Business and Public Administration here at UND. We want to thank each and every one of you for coming to one of our colleges and one of the university's signature events, and also an event that we put on in partnership with the College of Arts and Sciences here at UND as well. This is the 13th annual Olofsson Ethics Symposium, and the purpose of the Olofsson Ethics Symposium is to provide a platform and a framework for students, for our faculty, our staff, and the community, the business community, and others to explore the importance and the intersections of both personal and professional ethics. It is a terrific topic, one that is always timely no matter what, and one that is certainly timely today and this evening. This annual event is made possible through some generous support. First, want to recognize the SEI Investments Company for its support. Mark Morgan is somewhere out here. Mark, thank you very much for helping to make this possible this evening. And SEI. We can't possibly put on events without the generous support. It comes from individuals, it comes from corporations, it comes from others, foundations and such. Speaking of individuals, we also want to recognize Bob Olofsson. Bob has been a dedicated servant and practitioner of ethics throughout his career, and is a tremendous friend to the College of the College of Business and Public Administration and to the University of North Dakota. And of course, it's with Bob's generous support as well that this event is occurring. So Bob, we'd ask you to stand as well. If I may, just on a personal note, I would say that I couldn't be more honored to join the symposium this year in this particular role. I'm faculty here also in the College of Business and Public Administration. This leadership role, because actually in 2008, I was privileged, along with my frequent research collaborator, Catherine Rand at the law school, to be the featured speakers for the keynote event. And at that time, the Jack Abramoff scandal, for those of you who remember that lobbyist, a disgraced lobbyist, that scandal had rocked Washington and the political establishment. And so Catherine and I were invited at that point to talk about the intersections of big business and big government, and how that led Jack Abramoff, or didn't lead him necessarily, but he chose to build a couple of American Indian tribes in Texas who were looking to open casinos. And so there were very interesting questions of ethics and the intersections of business and government and personal and professional at that point. Now, when Bob suggested this year's topic, when we were talking about it and thinking about it, we started with a similar premise to that from 9 years ago, that business and government and the American public are faced with a set of challenges when things start to go wrong across those sectors. And so in this instance, where the ethics of business and government are challenged, the question that we have today is how to navigate a changing landscape, a landscape where data and evidence and information and facts and such are up for grabs. And if that's the case, then what happens from there? What an interesting set of questions. And indeed, it is a university, like the University of North Dakota, that is best positioned to bring people together to think about those challenges and what we do about them. If we do anything, how do we face them? Because it's a university that has the opportunity for informed dialogue, for critical inquiry, for the discovery and exchange of knowledge and facts and ideas. So think about for a minute an environment that some have called a post-truth environment, or an environment where alternative facts or fake news are viewed as the new normal. What does that mean? What does that mean for us as individuals? What does that mean in the workplace? What does that mean in civic society? What does that mean in business, in government, in the not-for-profit sectors, and beyond? So such interesting questions, and what a terrific opportunity. Before I turn the stage over and we start that conversation, I do want to encourage all of you to join our conversation this evening, and we have a couple of ways that you can do that. So put on your thinking caps. One option is for you to engage with question and answer with our distinguished guest, Mara Eliason, later in the event. And there will be folks with microphones that will make their way around. And we do ask that you use the microphone because we are being live streamed this evening. Another option is to tweet in any question that you might have. And tweeting is very relevant for tonight's conversation as well. And you can tweet in your question during the event at hashtag UNDBizOES, as in Olafson Ethics Symposium. So really do engage with us and engage in the conversation. Well, now it's my pleasure to introduce our university's president, President Mark Kennedy. President Kennedy is here along with the First Lady, Debbie Kennedy. And in their time at UND, they truly have been leaders in action. President Kennedy has hit the ground running with a strategic plan. Many of us are familiar with the plan that has generated important conversations and important action throughout the campus across the platforms of what we do as a university of learning, discovery, and engagement. And President Kennedy is emblematic of what we do in the College of Business and Public Administration and what we're invited to do this evening, which is think about the intersections of business and government. So with that, I would invite President Kennedy to join us.
Thank you, Steve, and we certainly welcome Mara here to the land of the frozen chosen, where few are called, but many are frozen. But we cherish this environment and relish in our great four-season environment here. I want to echo the thanks to Bob Olafson and SEI for making this possible. This is what a university is about, to bring together the community, students and members of the community, to hear great thought and debate big issues. We're pleased to have Mara Eliason here. You all know her as the NPR award-winning journalist on All Things Considered or Morning Edition. Covered 6 presidents, if you think about that. Right up there, front and personal, with 6 presidents. Received the White House Correspondents' Merriman Smith Award 3 times. So this is a real rock star journalist. But I think there's 3 reasons why I'm particularly excited that we're having Mara here today. The first is she's a journalist. She reports the news. And when you listen to her, you're getting not the spin that she's chosen to put on it for this particular audience, but her deep thought as what she's given on the subject. The second thing is, one of the things I encourage is to have a 360-degree view, see all sides of every issue. That's what a liberal arts-based university like University of North Dakota should do. And so if you see somebody that's both on NPR and on the Fox All-Stars and can cover that degree of range, you know that you think in a 360-degree view and are not just pigeonholing yourself in one area or another. But I think perhaps the thing that makes me most excited is she loves engaging with students. When I was at George Washington University leading the Graduate School of Political Management, we would regularly have Mara over coming to our building at George Washington, and students loved engaging with her. She loves engaging with them. A graduate of Brown University, like our former head of our State Board of Higher Education, Kathy Nesit, in American history. We are honored to have Mara Eliason. Please welcome her.
Well, thank you for that really kind introduction. I am happy to be here in North Dakota, and yes, I have been here before, which is, people from the East Coast don't often get chances to come to North Dakota, but I have been here before, and I was even here really recently when President Trump came to Bismarck to make this tax reform speech. It was very warm and sunny that day. But I am grateful to be here. Thank you to Bob for sponsoring this incredible event for 13 years, and I'm honored to be the 13th, and 13th is my lucky number. That's my birthday. But I'm also grateful for the opportunity that you have given me to take a break from my regularly scheduled programming when, depending on what day it is, I'm not sure if I am covering the House of Cards, The West Wing, The Sopranos, or King Lear. And I do cover politics, which I know to so many people is a dirty word, but because you are highly educated members of an august university, you know that the word politics comes from the Greek word polis, which means many, and ticks, which means blood-sucking insects. But politics really is just a nonviolent way of working out our differences, and we should be grateful that we have politics, because there are places around the world where there are no politics and people just shoot at each other when they disagree. So politics, however imperfect and messy and infuriating, is an alternative to warfare. And I just want to say that in terms of the subject of this lecture series, I am going to take a very broad view of ethics. I'm going to talk about fake news and ethical standards and civic virtue and democratic values and institutions, because I think that understanding what civility is, what ethical standards are in public life, are the key to a better politics, and even more importantly, to a functioning liberal, that's small l, democracy. And ever since Donald Trump got elected, I have found myself thinking about what makes a functioning liberal democracy and why the United States has the very best, strongest liberal democracy the world has ever seen, at least if we can keep it that way. All of our democratic institutions right now are undergoing a kind of stress test, and all of the things that are supposed to bind us together and make it possible to find common ground are under tremendous pressure. And I also think that the burden and responsibilities of being a citizen of the United States of America are greater today than they have ever been, maybe since World War II. And all of you have heard about American exceptionalism. America is a shining city on a hill. Well, there are a lot of reasons why that's true and why for over 200 years so many people have wanted to come here. And America is an idea. It's not just a country fighting for our bigger piece of the pie in the world, zero-sum game, but America was based in the Enlightenment, and our founding fathers believed in science and humanism. They believed that people could discern the truth by themselves. They didn't have to be told by their rulers what to believe, what was true or not, what was fake news or not. And in America, nationalism is also unique. It's not based on ethnic heritage or some blood and soil connection like it is in so many places in the world. In America, nationalism is based on shared values like tolerance and respect and fairness and equality under the law. And that's why people from all different races and backgrounds come here and are welcomed and become Americans. So even as we have our own separate identities and backgrounds, we have one overarching identity. We are all American. And we also have a unique system of governance. We don't just have elections. We have all these institutions that make us more free than other countries. And those institutions work because we have norms and standards and customs and ethical standards that aren't written laws, but they are part of the way we conduct ourselves in the public sphere. Norms like self-restraint and respect, even shame. All these things help us maintain a civic society. Now, ethical standards are the way that we express ourselves. Public servants express themselves through their behavior. And these norms, oftentimes there's very little penalty for breaking them. They're not written into law. But what I think is happening right now in American politics is that all of these norms and ethical standards are being stretched to the breaking point. For instance, it used to be considered to be unethical, or it used to be considered ethical, for a candidate to release their tax returns, for a president of the United States to divest themselves from their business. Even Jimmy Carter sold his peanut farm. It used to be considered ethical for a president to prevent their staffers from going on television and hawking products made by their daughter. it used to be considered, and there was even a ruling from the Office of Government Ethics, that a president shouldn't personally profit from government business. But now that particular head of the Office of Government Ethics is gone, and the new one apparently has found that it is ethical for the State Department to promote Donald Trump's hotels and to encourage visiting foreign dignitaries to stay there. So there are no laws preventing these things, but the question is, how far do we want to push the ethical envelope? There are other things that make up the civic norms and ethical standards in American politics. For instance, we try to be respectful to people with opposing views. We don't demean people who are different from us. We don't demonize our opponents or casually encourage violence against people we disagree with. We try to be honest. We try not to lie all the time. We believe that there is such a thing as facts, and that it's a good idea to find what they are first and then form our opinions rather than the other way around. We try to be courteous. We try to uphold the simple rules of decorum that we have spent years and years trying to get our children to follow. So we recoil when our leaders are casually cruel or misogynistic, and we don't like it when the president's opponents become mirror images of his behavior, just as intolerant, just as extreme. And all those things, civility, restraints, a high level of ethical standards, moderation when possible, compromise when necessary, all of these virtues are the foundations of a functioning liberal democracy. And all of this works because we have strong democratic institutions, institutions that are supposed to frustrate the ambitions of anyone with authoritarian tendencies or extreme unethical behavior. So, institutions and values like, for instance, the First Amendment, freedom of speech and assembly. That's why you can stand in front of the White House with a sign and not get arrested. Free press, which means no one in the government tells me what I can write or say on the radio. We have an independent judiciary, which means everyone is equal under the law. Everyone, rich or poor, powerful or weak, is supposed to be subject to the same rules. That's the rule of law. And we have checks and balances, co-equal branches of government that if they work the way our founders intended, no one branch of government, the president or the Supreme Court or the Congress, can get too powerful. Now this can be extremely frustrating, and it was meant to be a little frustrating because too often nowadays our system is gridlocked and stuck and it can't get anything done. But the idea of checks and balances, which were invented by our founders, was to force a certain amount of bipartisanship, to make sure that the minority party had rights and that no one party or person or branch of government could rule without some amount of buy-in from the rest of government, because that way we're forced to work for some kind of consensus. So I mentioned that right now our democratic institutions are undergoing a real stress test, and I just want to go through a couple of these institutions to see how they're doing. Congress, for instance. You have a trend right now in the Senate where the rights of the minority party are being chipped away. The filibuster, for instance, is something that was supposed to force the parties to find some common ground, not to be abused as an instrument of gridlock. But the transformation of the Senate as the body where collegiality and compromise were possible into something that looks a lot more like the simple majority rule of the House started long before the current administration, but it's accelerating, and you also have Donald Trump calling for the Senate to get rid of the legislative filibuster. They've already chipped away at it for certain judicial nominations. You also have this split inside the Republican Party. On the one hand, you have this acceptance or at least silence about the eroding of norms on the part of the president. Just as a thought experiment, what would the reaction of Republicans be if a Democratic president, Hillary Clinton or any other one, maintained their business interests or a foundation or told the FBI to investigate their opponents? There would be, I guarantee you, impeachment proceedings right away. So the question is, what does it mean for ethical standards when a political party only cares about ethics when the opposition party has the White House? What happens when you push the boundaries as far as they can go? Now, on the other hand, in the Republican Party, you have a small group of Republicans who have made scathing criticisms of the president's erosion of democratic norms and ethical behavior. You have George W. Bush and John McCain and Bob Corker and Jeff Flake. This isn't an ideological debate inside the Republican Party. They're talking about Donald Trump's behavior. None of them are running for re-election. That tells you the limits of this dissent inside the party, but it is significant, and it's worth listening to John McCain, for example, who said recently, "We are all asleep to the necessity of our leadership and to the opportunities and real dangers of this world. We are asleep in our echo chambers, where our views are always affirmed and information that contradicts them is always fake. We are asleep in our polarized politics, which exaggerates our differences, looks for scapegoats instead of answers, and insists we get all our way all the time from a system of government based on compromise, principled cooperation, and restraint." That's what seems to be disappearing today in American politics. So that's the Congress. Then you've got the judiciary. The judiciary has come under pretty relentless fire from this president. He's disparaged individual judges. He said our criminal justice system is a joke and a laughingstock. He said if there was a terrorist attack, the whole court system should be blamed. He fired the FBI director, which was perfectly legal and within his powers, but he also said he did it to get himself out from under the cloud of the Russia investigation. That was legal for sure. Was it ethical? Well, Bob Mueller is going to determine that. Donald Trump has also expressed what he said was his frustration and sadness at not being able to direct the FBI to go after his political enemies, but he still has tweeted recently, "Let's go, FBI and DOJ, go investigate the Democrats and Hillary Clinton." This from a president whose main chant at his rallies when he was a candidate was "lock her up." So some people are wondering, are we in the United States of America or Venezuela? Then there's the press, or the enemy of the people, as Trump likes to call us. And this is where fake news really comes in. There are a lot of layers to this. There's fake news and real fake news. And fake news has become an epithet. It's just a way for anyone to disparage news coverage they don't like. But fake news is a real thing. You could call it propaganda or lies. One of the biggest recent bits of fake news was birtherism, which is the false claim that Barack Obama was born in Kenya and therefore an illegitimate president. And Donald Trump, of course, was the original big birther. This is how he came onto the national political scene back in 2011 when he was thinking about running for president in 2012, and it really did fuel his rise. Then there was the fake news brought to us by Russia when it interfered in the election of 2016, and that is fake news as an act of war or fake news as a national security issue. So in addition to hacking and weaponizing Democratic emails and trying to hack into at least 29 states' voter registration files, Russia also deployed a pretty sophisticated cyber campaign consisting of fake stories. Some of them were about Hillary Clinton. Russia used bots and algorithms to get these stories into just the right social media feeds of just the right voters in key battleground states around the country, whether they were targeted at certain white voters who said that Hillary Clinton was running a child sex ring out of a pizzeria in Washington, or to black voters who said that Hillary Clinton was going to jail your kids, or to young Democrats who were told by some of these fake news accounts that you could vote online. All you had to do was text #Hillary and you will have voted. How many fell for that? We don't know. 150 million Americans saw this content. Google and YouTube say there were 1,100 Russian video accounts. Twitter says there were 37,000 Russian accounts. Facebook said there were 60 million fake accounts impersonating Americans. And it turns out that our big social media giants became pipelines for Russian propaganda. So what was the purpose? It wasn't just to help Donald Trump and hurt Hillary Clinton. It was to exacerbate our differences and our divisions, make us even more racially polarized, undermine our faith in democratic institutions, in particular the ballot and free and fair elections. When Russia hacked into those 29 state voter registration files, they did it in a very sloppy way, and they left a lot of breadcrumbs. And the security agencies in Washington were puzzled by this. Why? Russia is really good at this. Why would they do it in such a sloppy manner? And the conclusion of some of them was that Russia wanted the US to know that they could hack into voter files, that they could potentially actually change votes, not just influence the way people thought by propaganda, but actually change votes. We don't know, we don't think that they did that, but what they wanted to do was undermine Americans' faith that their election system, their ballot, was free and fair. And this happened to amplify, either by coincidence or design, exactly what Donald Trump was saying on the stump during the campaign and later as president, that the voting system was rigged. The only way he could lose is if the election was stolen from him. He never consented to accept the results of the election if he wasn't the winner. And since the election, he said that 3 to 5 million illegal immigrants voted illegally for Hillary Clinton, so she actually didn't win the popular vote. So fake news, repeated often enough, really works. I think still a big chunk of Republicans, I've seen polls, 25–30% of Republicans still believe Barack Obama was not born in the United States. So to a large extent, Russia succeeded. Faith in our democratic institutions, including the ballot, was already shaky, and it only got worse over the last 2 years. Then there are the direct attacks on the mainstream press as fake news. We've heard the president threaten to get rid of the license of NBC because he doesn't like what they were reporting. They were the ones who broke the story about Rex Tillerson calling him a moron, or talking about him as a moron in a meeting. He's talked about changing the libel laws. He's talked about blocking the merger of AT&T and Time Warner because Time Warner is the owner of CNN. He doesn't like them. He's tweeted this gif of Donald Trump body slamming CNN, a kind of fake wrestler with a CNN head. He's tweeted the video of a little figure of CNN being run over by a train. At his rallies, where the press is confined to a little corral, you can see occasionally supporters wearing T-shirts that say "Rope, Tree, Journalist, Some Assembly Required." So all of these attempts to call the mainstream press fake news have a strategy behind them. All presidents hate their press coverage. All presidents complain about the media, but I think Donald Trump is taking this to a whole new level, and I think it's working. A recent Politico Morning Consult poll showed that 46% of Americans said that the press just makes stuff up about Donald Trump. When that poll came out, Donald Trump tweeted the results of the poll. He said, look, 46% of Americans think the press makes stuff up about me. He said, it's finally sinking in. In other words, he was declaring victory. So the corrosion of support for First Amendment principles did not start with Donald Trump. He just accelerated it. And I'm going to give you some depressing statistics. 28% of Americans think that the federal government should have the power to revoke licenses of networks if the government considers what is on the network to be fake news. Now, just as another thought experiment, what if Barack Obama had suggested revoking the license of the Fox News network? I mean, we would have had people in the streets. 43% of people agree that colleges have the right to ban controversial speakers. Only 59% say religious freedom in the US should apply to all religions. And here are the underlying measurements. Only 26% of Americans polled in an Annenberg poll could name the 3 branches of government. And only 37% could name even one right guaranteed by the First Amendment. So, there is another reason why fake news is so easily spread and why ethical standards are so easily rejected and ignored, and that is that America is way too polarized. And this is a huge problem. You can see it in Congress. There used to be conservative Democrats and liberal to moderate Republicans, and together the overlap between those two groups made up the center of American politics. That's where deals got done and compromises got made, where common ground was found. But that center is depopulated now. It's just a big abyss. Most members of Congress live in safe districts. The only thing they worry about is a primary challenge from the left if you're a Democrat and the right if you're a Republican. And it's not just gerrymandering, although that plays a role in the House of Representatives. There's actually a partisan gerrymandering case before the Supreme Court right now about, I'm sure you're familiar with this because it's right in your neighborhood. The Wisconsin state legislative districts Republicans won the statewide vote by 46%, but they ended up with 60% of the districts because they had so artfully drawn the boundaries of those districts. But even beyond gerrymandering, one of the reasons we're so polarized is a phenomenon that sociologists call the big sort. Americans have sorted themselves out, so they live in more homogeneous communities. We now tend to live near other people who look like us, think like us, vote like us, worship like us. For all the diversity in America, there is a tremendous amount of self-segregation, and I don't mean racially. On social media, we share and like and retweet people we agree with, and we ignore or unfriend or block people we don't agree with. People also tend to consume media that agrees with them. Somebody was telling me that they heard Chuck Todd on NPR today talking about the too many listeners. He has Meet the Press on Sunday. Too many of his viewers want affirmation, not information. And the media itself is polarized. You know, the joke is Fox and MSNBC don't even cover the same natural disasters anymore. I'm the exception that proves that rule. I've been on Fox for 19 years, and I've been on NPR for 32. We also have this strange phenomenon that fact-checking in the media doesn't matter anymore. It used to be a deal breaker. If a politician ran a commercial that had something in it that was wrong, that wasn't backed up by evidence, and they got a bad grade from the fact-checkers or 4 Pinocchios from the Washington Post, that was terrible. It was really going to hurt them. But it doesn't matter anymore. 66% of Americans said Donald Trump wasn't honest or trustworthy, but he got elected anyway. And that's because our politics are so tribal now that a poll in Wisconsin taken right before the presidential election among just Republicans showed that by large majorities, Republican voters in Wisconsin thought the economy was terrible. A couple days after the election, same pollster went back to the same people, and of course Donald Trump had just won, and they were polled again and asked the exact same question, and voila, they thought the economy was great. So our system is becoming reality resistant. And for a system that's based on compromise and cooperation and restraint, if we no longer agree on the facts and then work our way to opinions as opposed to vice versa, how are we going to have a civil debate? And how are we going to find common ground and solutions? It doesn't matter anymore what the issues are or what people think about the issues. You stick with your team and your tribe and your party no matter what. And, you know, during the campaign, Trump famously said that he could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot someone and he wouldn't lose any voters. And that probably is about right, because partisan identity has become the most important identity. And a Pew poll taken not long ago showed that 47% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats said that they would be very unhappy if a child of theirs married somebody from the opposite party. So, tribalism is rampant, and it's bad, and it corrodes democratic institutions and values. And we also, and I don't want to really heap all this on Donald Trump because he didn't start this, but he has accelerated it and personified it in a lot of ways. But presidents used to think of themselves as having a kind of moral authority and a responsibility to unite the country, especially after times of national tragedy. But Donald Trump has often chose division. He blamed Puerto Ricans after Hurricane Maria hit the island. He blamed New York Senator Chuck Schumer after the terrorist attack in Manhattan. So he often, and this happens on the left and the right, identity politics pushes people apart, doesn't bring them together. And you see that all over the political spectrum. It's hard to remember that recently a member of Congress was shot at baseball practice, Steve Scalise. He's now returned to Congress and he is healing, but it's going to be a long road. And after that happened, and yes, members of Congress had been shot before by deranged constituents, but because this happened in Washington with a big group of members, there was a feeling that finally a moment had come when people would start toning down the extremes of political rhetoric, that the professional outrage machine would be tamped back. And a lot of people thought that that incident was going to be a tipping point and the kind of the end of the partisans making anger into an industry. But that moment passed. And the problem is that a polarized country is more susceptible to fake news, and fake news makes us more polarized. It's really a vicious circle. And that's what Russia tried to do to intensify our divisions and our resentments, whether they were racial, ideological, or partisan. So, what can we do about this? We actually can do something about this, and I'm going to give you a list of suggestions. Even though the centripetal forces seem overwhelming and inexorable, I actually believe that they can be overcome. Democracy can be protected with constant vigilance and never-ending participation. And I said earlier that the burdens of being a U.S. citizen are pretty high right now. I actually think that's unfair on a certain level. I think part of the luxury of being a citizen of a highly functioning liberal democracy is that you can tune out politics every 2 years. You have to go and vote, but you shouldn't have to obsess about politics all the time. You should take it for granted that our country is functioning and our democratic values are safe and protected. But I think that's not where we are right now. So here are a couple suggestions to deal with the erosion of ethical standards, the burgeoning of fake news. Number one, get out of your safe space. Stop talking only to people who agree with you. As someone who was once president of the United States once said, if you're tired of arguing with someone who disagrees with you on the internet, how about talking to them in real life? Have some conversations. You can also start by consuming news from sources that you don't automatically agree with. If you don't like fake news and alternative facts, well, it's your job to be able to tell the difference. Educate yourself. Look at different sources. Look at aggregators of news, websites that link to information from all different sources on the ideological spectrum. Real Clear Politics is an example of that. You can simply be a better citizen. Learn about who makes the decisions on your behalf by going to a city council meeting or a town hall meeting or a meeting that your congressman holds. Run for office, run for school board or dog catcher or city council, and join a group. It can be political, but it doesn't have to be. Just some group that meets regularly, anything. A gamers group, a bowling league, ultimate frisbee, a book club. Any group, a group that volunteers in a soup kitchen. Just do something on a regular basis with other people. I think a surefire way for democracy to die is for all of us to be sitting alone in front of our screens. And you are a heck of a lot more likely to believe in a conspiracy theory or a piece of fake news on the internet if you have no one else to check it out with. Remember when Donald Trump said he knew that the protester at his airport hangar rally was a terrorist? And people said, how did you know that? He said, I read it on the internet. And recently, just today, it was reported that he asked his CIA director to meet with a conspiracy theorist, a guy who believed that the DNC hack was an inside job. And Pompeo met with him. So if you read fake news on the internet and then you go out to your group or your book club or your basketball game and you tell your friends about what you just read, they might give you a reality check like that is totally false, or here's another point of view. So if you spend all day in front of your screen, especially in an election year, you are more likely to be reading what Vladimir Putin wants you to believe. The other thing you can do is advocate for civics curriculum in K through 12. If kids have no idea what democratic values and institutions are, how are they supposed to know when they're being eroded? And part of that civics curriculum, and there actually are now curriculums being developed for elementary school and high school that do this, is how to tell the difference between fake news and real news. What's a primary source? What's a secondary source? How can you tell the difference? If you see an IP address from someone in your Facebook feed from Macedonia, that's a clue, even if they say their name is Bob Buford from Alabama. And here's a goofy one, but I think it's a suggestion. If you are a young conservative graduating from college, move to New York or California instead of Texas or Arkansas. If you are a young liberal graduating from college, don't move to New York or California, move to Texas or Michigan or Wisconsin or North Dakota. Here's another crazy idea, advocate for the return of the draft. Yep, compulsory national service with a non-military option. I think it's a tragedy that we're protected by such a tiny segment of our society. I don't know how many of you saw that press conference that John Kelly had in the White House after the big controversy about the Gold Star mother and what Donald Trump said to her or not, but he talked about how few, number one, how few people have served. That's the 1%. That's what he sees as the 1% in the country, and also how few people know anybody who's served. The other thing that you can do is support fact-based journalism. We still exist. We're working very hard, and we really appreciate your support. Support new ventures, like something that's going to debut in 2018 called NewsGuard. This is a new enterprise that's founded by Steve Brill, who started a lot of really good publications, and Gordon Krovitz, who used to publish the Wall Street Journal. And it's basically going to rate news content for news organizations, but also for individuals, so we can tell what's fake and what's not fake. Support local news. You guys have real local newspapers in North Dakota, but in too many parts of the country, there is no more local news. Everything comes from afar, so it's easier to believe something that's fake. So I just want to end my comments by saying this: I believe that this whole discussion of ethics and fake news and civic society and civic virtue is really about patriotism. It is a patriotic act to recommit yourself to civic virtue and to being the best citizen in the best democracy the world has ever seen, and to exhibit the kind of behavior that will lead us to find compromise and solutions. I think that we look to Washington for role models. Maybe it's time, at least for the moment, to look somewhere else and to model, for our kids the way we want them to act. And just because someone acts in a certain way at the highest levels of society and politics and government doesn't mean that that's what we want our kids to be. So we're never going to be this kumbaya society, and nor should we be. Politics is about deep, deep divisions and differences. But if we lose the ability to solve these differences in a civil way, we really will lose our democracy. So I'll stop talking right here, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions. Okay, so how are we going to do this? Are there mics or something? I can't see any of you guys.
Laura with the mic right back there.
Okay.
Don't be shy, you're a big audience.
Holy moly! I've stunned you into silence.
Hi. So
Okay.
you were talking about earlier when you were going on, as you were saying that had this been a flip side of some of the things Trump had done, as Hillary had done certain things, there would have been impeachment processes going on. What do you think it is that it hasn't already happened for Trump? Because he's been, so why do you think that hasn't started?
Well, first of all, a couple of things. Impeachment is a high bar, but also he has a Congress of the same party. So Congresses generally don't impeach presidents of their own party. I'm just talking about Republican reaction to these kind of ethical and normative transgressions. And these are exactly the kind of things that they would complain about when Democrats were in office. It hasn't happened because parties don't impeach their own president. I think it's as simple as that.
Hi, Mara. So within these highly polarized times, how do we go about having a conversation maybe with one another, even if it's with somebody we don't agree with, on how to kind of find our shared values and not focus so much on the differences?
Well, I think that's what you'd start with. You start with shared values, and you start with, a conversation about what unites us and what makes us American. And I do think this is a first principles moment, and I think if we go back to agreeing on first principles, it might make it easier to talk about all the other stuff. You know, look, this is just a little example. You know, my kids go to like a progressive private school in Washington, and they don't say the Pledge of Allegiance, and it drives me nuts. And I've been in there like several times to talk to the principal, like, why not say the Pledge of Allegiance? Some parents might not like that. Good, have a debate about it. Talk about why we say the Pledge of Allegiance, why we do things like that. That would be a great idea. You know, just start with something that connects us and move on from there. And try to establish a shared set of facts. I don't think, as much as it seems like we're being taken over by fake news and alternative facts and super divisive tribal rhetoric, I would say the majority of Americans don't want that. The majority of Americans want to have a civil conversation with their friends and their family and their neighbors.
Hi. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
We like that.
As you probably heard, you know, it's often been said that money is the mother's milk of politics. It seems that nobody with grounding, common sense can run for public office unless they're backed by millionaires and billionaires. There's been a movement for public funding of elections. I think that could be a solution if we could all get together and, you know, fund somebody from the bottom rather than from the top.
Yeah, I mean, campaign finance reform, what you're talking about, I think would be a solution. But on the other hand, Donald Trump did not spend a lot of money. He spent very little money. And, you know, it's interesting because Citizens United, which is the Supreme Court ruling that allowed kind of billionaires, anonymous billionaires, to fund campaigns, didn't kick in 2016. It's going to kick in now, believe me, because now that he's in office, there are tremendous numbers of conservative billionaires who are backing him. But he didn't spend a lot of money, and that was not a triumph of big money. You know, he dominated social media. That was the way that he ran. He got tremendous amounts of what we call free media, just news coverage. So I think that the chances that Congress would pass anything, you know, to get big money out of politics, especially after the Supreme Court decision, are pretty slim. But I think what we have seen, especially with Bernie Sanders, even with Trump, with Barack Obama when he ran the first time, it is possible to fund a campaign with small contributions.
Hi, I have a
Hi.
quick question about the field of journalism in terms of career prospects, right? So since you started, things have changed pretty dramatically. We've seen that people use bots now, we see Breitbart, and so from an entrepreneurial point of view, there have been a lot of new developments in the market. As a journalism student, where do you see the opportunities to kind of participate in the field that maybe weren't there 20 years ago?
Well, I think there are a lot of opportunities that weren't there 20 years ago. First of all, the interesting thing about bots is that, look, right now, it seems like the bots and the fake news are ahead of us, and they are, but we can catch up. And there's something that I just recently subscribed to on Twitter or followed. I can't remember the name of the feed, but the thing that they use is something called a botometer, and it tells you if a certain Twitter post is from a bot, and it analyzes it by certain technical or technological criteria, and it'll say, this post has a 65% likelihood of being a bot. I mean, that's an innovation. You know, that's something that I think journalists will start using. Even despite all the things that are happening in journalism, you could argue that we're having a kind of golden age of journalism right now. For instance, if you look at the web traffic on all sorts of websites, the mainstream sites, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, even NPR is now up to 99 million listeners a week, I think. All of them have gone up by like 10, 15, 20% over the last year, and Breitbart and Drudge are down, which I was surprised at. Just in terms of web traffic, I'm not saying they're not influential or they don't get, amplified on social media, but you know, people are interested in fact-based journalism, and they're showing that with their feet and their subscriptions. And for all that Donald Trump talks about the failing New York Times or the failing this or the failing that, actually, you know, traditional fact-based media or news organizations that try to be fact-based are having a pretty good time. And old-fashioned reporting still matters. I mean, why is Tom Price no longer the Health and Human Services Secretary? Because Politico, a website in Washington, decided to take a look at his travel habits. And they spent months and months following him around and found out that he spent tremendous amounts of money on private air charter even when he was traveling from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia. That seemed kind of swampy to Donald Trump, and he got rid of him because he was kind of, you know, against his brand. So, you know, old-fashioned journalism still matters. And the advice that I'd give to young people going into the field now, it's harder. I mean, I've worked for the same news organization for 32 years. That's pretty unusual. Now, you know, the young journalists at NPR have had like 5 different employers before they come to us. But if you are a good writer and you're really interested in your subject matter and you're adept at providing content on all platforms, and now there are many, many platforms, you can do really well.
So I'm just looking through Mark Zuckerberg, his Facebook, and I want to relate this back to sort of corporate responsibility. He says, Trump says Facebook is against him. Liberals say we help Trump. Both sides are upset about ideas and content they don't like. That's what running a platform for all ideas looks like. So I guess what
When did he say that?
September 28th. And so I feel like he's saying that if I'm upset with viral misinfo and fake news, I'm just uncomfortable with ideas.
That's what he used to say.
Yeah, so if you could relate this to
Yeah.
maybe what sort of responsibilities corporations
Yep.
and social media platforms have in this, and then also, is it ethically and morally responsible to continue to give a platform to those who deliberately mislead?
Okay, that is an excellent question, and I should have discussed this in my remarks, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because that's what Mark Zuckerberg said in September before his people had to testify in Congress. They used to say, we're just a neutral platform, like, you know, like that quote, like, well, if you're not uncomfortable with this is just the free exchange of ideas. Then they found out that there were 60 million fake Facebook accounts impersonating Americans. And now they're saying, oh, we're going to do a better job at policing this, and if a site is fake, we're going to block it or get rid of it. We're going to hire 1,000 or 10,000, I think he said, new editors, human editors that are going to try to police this, because the social media giants are the biggest publishers on the planet. And to Congress right now, they look like big unregulated utilities. And they're going to be regulated, either by themselves or by Congress, I believe. And I don't think that people should be blocked because of the content of their speech, but these social media companies are starting to block people if they're not for real. In other words, I'm sure, I don't know how many of you saw the story of there was a, you know, fake account, showed a picture of a guy with his kids, with fake name, turned out, you know, some Russian, the troll factory, I forget the name of it, the something research agency, went out and the guy was Brazilian. They just stole some pictures from the internet and created a fake person. That is not okay. So the social media companies have a tremendous responsibility. Congress is finally turning their attention to them. They were very unhappy with the answers they got in the last round of hearings. And I think you're going to see the social media companies pressured to do something about this. That one of the expectations you should have if you're on social media is that you are going to be able to be exposed to all different kinds of views. But the views should be from real people, not bots or Russian trolls.
Hi, just a quick question. You mentioned some, like, you said you announced them as depressing stats, and I was just wondering, like, what the population sample was, who they were, and what the size was.
Okay, that I don't know. They came from different polls. I would have to go back and look. I don't have that off the top of my head. But those numbers are very consistent with what we've seen in poll after poll after poll. Just the level of civic literacy is pretty low in the United States.
So here in North Dakota, we the citizens have the power of ballot initiative and referenda, which is wonderful. And it's worked pretty well for a long time. Some cycles there'd be nothing, some cycles there'd be 2 or 3 or 4 things to consider and vote on. Over the last 3 cycles, we've started to see a proliferation of out-of-state funding and interest come into this. And as a citizen and a voter and someone who works with young people, I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit and give us some advice of how not to turn into California with regard to initiative and
Yeah.
referenda.
Well, that's California is the cautionary tale on this. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what kind of campaign finance laws you have in North Dakota, but why should these referendum be able to be funded from out of state, for instance? That's one thing maybe that would be a reform. I mean, California, which is really interesting because not only did they have this referenda process that kind of got out of control, and for a long time they were considered the ungovernable state. But they did do some things. They have had a couple reforms, not necessarily on the referendum front, but they have the top 2 primary now, which takes some of the partisanship and extremes out of the primary process. Because before in California and in most states, when Republicans would get in a primary or Democrats, generally they'd be pushed to the extreme because the only people who come out in a primary are the right wing of the Republicans and the left wing of the Democrats. Now they have the top 2 primary, which means the primaries are open. Everybody's in the same primary. And the top 2 vote getters, they could be 2 Republicans, they could be 2 Democrats, go on to the general election. Now, California is a blue state. It hasn't really changed the fact that they're a blue state, but in the state legislature, what I understand is there are more moderate Democrats being elected, and there's less of a punishment for people crossing the aisle and working in a bipartisan manner because they're not as afraid of a partisan primary challenge from their extreme. The other thing that California has and Iowa has is they have nonpartisan redistricting. That's a big reform. I don't know how many other states have that, but this is to address gerrymandering. They have a nonpartisan board, draw the districts so that they, more evenly distribute the population and are not kind of slicing and dicing and packing and cracking Democrats and Republicans to give advantages to incumbents.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for coming and speaking.
Thanks for having me.
I just was wondering if you had any personal suggestions as far as media sources for the real news to stay away from fake news.
Oh. Well, first of all, I think that there are many, many fact-based news organizations, the mainstream news organizations. And my other recommendation is that you consume news from different points of view. And you can either just go to different websites or you can go to a news aggregator like Real Clear Politics, where everything is curated for you, in other words, by subject matter. So if you want to hear every point of view, right, left, and center about immigration, they're going to give you that day's stories from all sorts of media in one area, and then you click on what you want to read. I mean, it's organized. And it's an aggregator, and it gives you kind of a really good broad spectrum view, and then you pick and choose what you want to read, but at least it's all there in front of you on one website. That's something I would suggest. The other thing is there are, as I said, there are curricula being developed for grade schools, but there also are guides to fake news. I mean, there are websites like Snopes.com that actually look into various stories and either debunk them or validate them. But there are guidelines, like how to figure out what the primary source is. Where do these stories come from? If they don't link to something, there's a problem with that. Same thing with your social media feed. Like I said, if you are getting, posts from some person that purports to live in Alabama and he's saying all sorts of wild things, maybe look at his IP address, and if it's from Macedonia, he's probably fake. Which is where a lot of these young kind of Russian-backed trolls, fake news purveyors congregated. So there are actual guides out there to spotting fake news. And, just be a more aggressive, informed consumer. And don't get your news from your social media feed. Why let somebody else decide what you're going to read and look at? Do it yourself.
So speaking of social media feeds, I'm over here, Mara.
Oh, sorry.
Before we have a question right here, I
Yeah.
do want to note that in fact the hashtag UNDBIZOER is operational, and you have some questions from Twitter.
Oh,
So
okay.
we do want to pay attention to our social media feed for just a moment.
Okay. You want me to read that one?
Yeah, if
Okay,
you got it. Yep.
Wait, ooh, are you scrolling up or down? You want number 3?
Sure.
Okay, with attention spans that seem to be shorter, coupled with lack of long reading and writing requirements in the U.S., how do we get people to persist to demand real deep reporting? Okay, good question. I think people are demanding real deep reporting. Not everybody, but the fact that all these news organizations are thriving that do real deep reporting, that do long-form reporting, means that there's still a market and an audience for these things. You know, how do we encourage it? You know, we invest in education. You know, we invest in liberal arts education and the humanities, and not everyone is going to operate a robot in a factory or be operated by a robot in a factory. But I think the audience for that kind of news still exists, and we just have to support it. Okay, what, if any, culpability does the news media hold in widely publicizing the untrue statements of Trump during the election versus focusing coverage on non-sensational candidates? That is an excellent question. There's been a lot of soul-searching done in the media. A lot of people think that CNN created Donald Trump because he was so entertaining, he was so good for ratings. What did CBS News' Leslie Moonves said? Trump might be bad for the country, but he's damn good for CBS. I mean, for the bottom line of CBS. There's no doubt a lot of culpability. He was covered disproportionately. His Republican opponents in the primary complained about this all the time. They couldn't get any coverage, and the only time Marco Rubio could get coverage is when he descended to the level of Donald Trump and started getting into that horrible kind of pissing match with him where he was saying kind of Trumpian things and they were engaging in insults. And he got a lot of coverage for that. Didn't work out so well for him because you can't really beat Donald Trump at his own game at that. But that was something that the cable nets in particular are really culpable for. And this, cable has 24 hours a day to fill, and they don't have enough to fill it, so they want things that are sensational and that will keep people glued to the screen. And this is a real problem because that's not going to go away. The kind of economic imperatives of cable news are not going to change. A real person, okay.
You talked about the importance of bringing the education of civil liberties, rights, and responsibilities back into K through 12. How do you think the conversation would change if not only those were brought back in a bigger way, but ethics and the importance of morals and ethics were added into that conversation?
I think ethics and morals should be, I think that's an integral part of a civics education. I think there should be ethics education, civics education, financial literacy, and then how to be a smart consumer of news. All those things should be part of a K through 12 curricula. I really believe that. I think that, we're talking about educating better citizens, and I think that that's really disappeared. It used to be it wasn't even there when I was in grade school, but it's disappeared, and I think it should come back.
Hello. I'm not a Trump supporter or a Trump hater, but I'm an average college student, and I'm trying to keep an open mind, as President Kennedy said, and I just have a question and like to take this opportunity to get the realest news I can. I hear a lot in the news on things that someone's done bad or negative aspects, but can you tell me just a couple of things that Trump as a president and as a leader has done well for our country in his time in office?
Sure. I can tell you several things. First of all, he has appointed a national security team that is strong and universally admired. His defense secretary, his national security advisor, John Kelly's now the chief of staff, but he was at Department of Homeland Security. That's something that a lot of Republicans will point to as saying that's one of the best things Trump has done. Now, if you're a conservative, he's done a lot of things that are successes that any conservative Republican president would have done, appointing Neil Gorsuch to the court, rolling back a lot of Obama-era regulations. All those things are positive, depending on your point of view, but he's appointed a really good national security team. And then there are good things that he has managed not to do. Like, he hasn't got us into a shooting war yet. That's good. But, you know, I think that he's done, you know, several good things. The problem is that Donald Trump wakes up every morning and his first impulse seems to be to divide or to create a controversy or to fight. I mean, that's what's succeeded for him his entire career. If you're in a fight, you know, you can be dominating and winning. And some of the fights I think he picks are just unnecessary for him. But, you know, they're part of the way that he dominates the scene and wins according to his own metrics for success.
Thank you. Keeping with the theme of looking at the flip side, could you perhaps speak to what's going on with the DNC, Donna Brazile, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, and the issues of what appears to be corruption, rampant corruption on the other side of the aisle?
Well, I don't know if there's rampant corruption. I can tell you that the Democrats are in a total and complete mess. I don't know if there's any legal corruption, but the Democrats are divided. They're in a circular firing squad right now. Instead of like figuring out what their message is and getting ready to run in 2018, they're kind of rehashing and relitigating the 2016 primary. I don't really know why Donna decided to drop this book at this exact moment, right before the Virginia governor's race, which I think we're getting results right now as we speak. But the Democrats, you know, are, you know, eating their young. I mean, they're just as divided as the Republicans are, and they don't have a leader, which the Republicans do. So I think that's all, you know, not good. You need to have two robust parties. You want a center-right party and a center-left party. And right now, we have a Republican Party that's moving further right and a Democratic Party that's in pretty much disarray. So, but in terms of the corruption stuff, I haven't heard of any illegalities. What are you talking about? Okay, and what was the unethical thing?
Debate
questions. The question. Okay.
Also the funding of the DNC or lack thereof, and the control of the funding by one campaign versus Bernie Sanders. The whole ethical sphere.
Okay, those two things. First of all, the question, that's a legitimate point. Donna Brazile, when she was a paid commentator at CNN, told Hillary Clinton that at a town hall meeting she might be asked about the issue of the water quality in Flint. Now, she probably shouldn't have told her anything that she might be asked, but that was like, to me, of course she was going to be asked about that. She's probably answered that question 100 times. She wasn't given a list of secret questions. Still, it's not good, and she lost her job because of that. So you could argue that an ethical standard was upheld. She was removed from CNN. Now, in terms of the funding agreement, there's a debate going on over that, whether that's something that was, you know, unethical for Bernie Sanders. Every single party does what the Democratic Party did in that fundraising agreement with Hillary Clinton. So I don't know if I consider that an ethical breach or not. I'd have to look into more of the details. What I've read so far is it seems that there was definitely a thumb on the scale for Hillary. It didn't change the outcome of the primary. She beat Bernie Sanders by a huge amount, but it's not unlike what other parties have done.
So we're coming to an hour where we're close to the end, and so I want to make sure if there is another Twitter question, and then we have one more that's back here, and we'll see where that lands us. Is there anything else up there? Any other tweets?
There's one other one. What has been the greatest ethical challenge in your career? Boy, that's a really good question, and I'd have to think about that. I think the greatest ethical challenge, I guess on a day-to-day basis, it's just trying, and all you can do, because we're all just human beings, is do the best you can, is just trying to stay fair and balanced and give both sides a chance to explain their point of view and be an analyst, not an opinion monger as a journalist. I would say that other ethical challenges have been when they haven't been difficult, but when I've found something out off the record and I have to abide by that agreement, even though it was a really great, juicy little tidbit, but I couldn't do anything with it because it was off the record and I wasn't able to confirm it on the record. You know, those are frustrating, and I guess you could consider that an ethical challenge, but those are lines you just can't cross in journalism. You know, off the record means off the record, and that's it, period.
So you mentioned the problem of polarization in our country and kind of alluded to the Wisconsin case where they used high-tech gerrymandering techniques. There's been some talk of using technology and census data to basically de-gerrymander some districts. What are your thoughts on that? Disregarding, of course, the practicality of actually implementing something like that.
Well, that can be done. I mean, it's possible to draw district lines that are fairer and that produce more competitive elections. It's absolutely possible to use the same technology that you gerrymandering with to ungerrymander. I think that ungerrymander. The question is, will parties agree to do that? Will the Supreme Court enact some kind of a partisan gerrymandering measure so they can tell when it's partisan gerrymandering or not, just as they did with racial gerrymandering? That's the question before the court. You know, how do you know when that happens? And you know, they had criteria for when they would determine something was racially gerrymandering. They haven't gotten to the point where they're willing to do that for partisan gerrymandering, but that's exactly what the Wisconsin case is. But yes, all that technology can be used to reverse gerrymanders too. But there has to be a political will to do that, and when Democrats are in control of the state legislature and the governor's office, like they are in Maryland, they're going to draw district lines that favor Democrats. And when Republicans have control of all state government in other states, they're going to draw the lines that, that favor them. So it's really tough. I mean, gerrymandering is an incumbent protection system. It's not partisan. It's bipartisan. Oh, yeah.
Do we have one last question?
Yeah.
Okay, it's going to be one last question.
Thank you very much. So I am a scientist, and so scientific ethics, one of the things that we do to uphold our scientific ethics is to go through a peer review process. Do you think that it's possible to incorporate a peer review type process into journalism, or would you consider syndication a type of peer review?
That's a really good question. I think that NewsGuard, that news site that I talked about, is trying to do something like that. I don't know if they'd call it peer review, but it's going to be some kind of a rating system or a ranking system that tries to separate fake news from real news. But that's not a bad idea. I mean, I don't know exactly how peer review works, but I think that's what this new group is trying to do. So thank you very much.
So, you know, peer review is a great way to end because actually that's part of what we're all doing is engaging in collective peer review. How many of you here are students? Tremendous. And so we just want Mara to see fabulous student participation, and many, if not most of the questions you received were from students. We want to thank all of you for being here and participating this evening, and we also especially want to thank Mara. I also want to give a quick shout out to Laura Arneson, Nikki Dvorak, and all the great people in the College of Business and Public Administration who helped to make this event possible. And let's give one final round of applause to Mara here, and thank you so much. Yes. It's a privilege to host an event like this, and we had some tremendous questions. Now, some of you have already noticed something important, which is that in the back of the room there is, in fact, a dessert buffet of some kind. And what better way to close the evening than to allow for some more conversation back there. Please enjoy, and thank you so much for joining us here this evening.